Hi. Hello, Terry. Welcome. Uh,
Well, thank you.
uh, I am I am super excited to have you as my guest today because you are my first teacher in my coaching journey, and I must say I feel privileged to have learned coaching from you.
Thank
So
you very
thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for being part of my diversity talks project. Let me quickly introduce you, and we can then move into the questions, my questions. Dr. Terrence Maltbia, Associate Professor of Practice and Department Organization and Leadership at Teachers College of Columbia University in New York, in the United States. You have more than 30 years of diverse experience as an external, internal organizational effectiveness consultant, educator, and leader. And since 2007, you have been the program director of Columbia University's coaching certification program. Um, Terry, my first question is about the relationship between diversity and organizational effectiveness. Why should organizations become more diverse? What's the benefit of it? What's the benefit of the organizations? And how does it affect organizational effectiveness?
sure. Well, number one, you start with a big question. I think it's a big and important question. I'm not sure that being more diverse is the aim, actually. I think becoming more diverse and or acknowledging the expanded diversity in organizations is really the starting point, right? And so being more diverse is really about expanding the diversity mixtures, and I'll come back to that. So I think even before we start talking about why organizations should become more diverse, I'll just briefly frame the conversation with conceptual clarity, because what I find
Yes.
is that many people jump into the conversation about diversity and then they say things like, for example, a diversity hire, right? And so when you say diversity hire, I'm wondering, all right, so what do you mean by that? And what they mean often are people who are non-majority hires. And yet when we define diversity, we'll define it as all inclusive. So all of a sudden we have conceptual confusion even before we've had a conversation. So I'll just start with diversity. The literal meaning of diversity is a point of difference, unlikeness, or variety, right? Multi-formality. So workplace diversity is the inclusion of individuals representing various dimensions of human diversity,
Mhm.
often inborn, things that we can't change, that are not very immutable to change, like national origin, race, gender, and so on. There are experience-based dimensions that are more immutable to change, right? Things like our educational background, marital status. We can even choose religion as we get older. We are sort of born into a cultural orientation around religion or not. And yet when we get older, we can make choices around that. So experience-based dimensions are more amenable to change, inborn or not. And then we all have personal style, which is often a collection of all of those things, like decision making, problem solving, and the
Mhm.
like. So
Mhm.
for me, human diversity is really characterized by unique mixtures of similarities and differences along those inborn experience-based. There's even organizational dimensions of diversity, line, staff, corporate, field, various functions that people are in, and so on. So when I say that becoming more diverse is the beginning, not the aim, that's really what I mean, because by nature, just natural demographic shifts, right? I'll start in the US. Organizations almost by definition are becoming more diverse, not necessarily by choice even,
Mhm.
but by changing demographics in the workplace, and the like. So to me, becoming more diverse can be about intentionality around these dimensions, but it also can be organic. As the demographics based on those various dimensions of diversity shift, how much choice does organizations really have? And so I'll take an example in the US, lots of things going on around the pandemic, which I think has just amplified this notion of the haves and has not,
Mhm.
which have already been around. It kind of just revealed dirty secrets that we already had that we thought we had gotten beyond, but just sort of amplified them. Like which groups got COVID at a higher rate, uh, which group was dying at a higher rate, and so on. Those things, not surprisingly, actually, just amplified some things that were already, going on. And so, yet, we look at our politics, so the American demographics are changing, it's impacting politics. So you see all kinds of voter suppression happening,
Mhm.
right? To try to realign the natural evolution of diversity. So I'm not sure that organizations really have a choice around increasing diversity. I think diversity is. The question becomes, what do you do with it,
Mhm.
right? So I don't think diversity, other than being different, really means anything until you modify it, right? So you can manage diversity, you can try to control it. You can understand diversity, try to learn what it means around these various unique mixtures. You can value diversity, and you can leverage diversity. So I think getting to your broader question, I think the aim of diversity, inclusion, and equity is not more diversity. It's leveraging the diverse mixtures, whatever they are, in the organization, because it's really the collective impact of not only understanding, but valuing those unique mixtures and then combining that with the capacity to create an environment that creates a shared vision and destiny.
Mhm.
So without that shared vision or destiny, the degrees of diversity don't really matter, because by definition, with increased diversity becomes the potential for increased conflict, misunderstanding, misalignment, etc.
Mhm.
So it's an ideal that we could say the business case is obvious. Well, not so much. Let's deal with the reality
Mhm.
that diversity is complex.
Mhm.
And when you increase complexity, so let's even look at inclusion. Inclusion by definition just sort of means the state of being included or invited or brought in. And so I think that's why we started with workplace diversity, and then later we added the label of inclusion, so bringing people in. But when you bring people in, it doesn't mean that they're bringing their whole self in. And in fact, if you bring people into a system that was not created for them, what you're really doing is asking them to assimilate and give up part of who they are.
Mhm.
But of course, you don't necessarily see it that way. So inclusion and diversity so diversity is about difference along those embedded dimensions, levels of inborn, personal, experience based, and so on. Inclusion is about being invited in, and yet equity, the quality of being fair, a state or a condition of being free of bias and injustice, that's a tall order, because what equity means, that's what it means literally, right? And so in order to do that, we are defying human nature, because there is a normality to bias, that bias is a normal natural process,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? And so if bias is a normal process, then equity is an ideal.
Mhm. Mhm. Can I interrupt and jump
Oh,
into my next question at this stage? Do you believe, so you you're a consultant, coach, educator, you have got amazing experience in adult learning. Can people change after a certain age,
yeah,
Terry?
I
Is
do
it,
think.
yeah,
Yeah,
go.
I do think people can change, and I know you're managing time, so I'll make this very quick. I just want to answer your first question explicitly.
Uh,
So I think when organizations leverage diversity, they can minimize the increased conflict associated with expanded diversity mixtures, while benefiting from a range of benefits. So what are those range of benefits? Accessing talent in the midst of changing demographics,
Mhm.
appealing to diverse market demographics, reducing legal issues, right? In countries where that's mandated. It can also increase teamwork, collaboration, innovation, productivity, and all of those things can generate results. So there is a clear business case to leveraging diversity. I'm not sure there's a clear business case to increasing diversity.
Mhm.
Right. So diversity again doesn't mean anything until you modify it.
Yeah.
So going back to your question about do I believe people can change?
Yeah, because you said that we have biases. Okay, so we're not born racist, but this is something that we learn at our childhood, and it get embedded in our configuration. So you do lots of work in adult learning. Can
Yeah,
people change
yeah,
after a
people,
certain break their
people,
biases and move into anti-racist?
yeah,
Become.
people can change. I would, um, although there's a cultural dimension to diversity, and racism, I'm not sure that we totally learn racism. And here's what I mean. Children as young as a few months old can identify the difference between mother and father, caregiver or not. And by 3 months, even before they can talk, they can distinguish between like me and not like me race wise. Like we know that, right? So that they haven't had a lot of acculturation. So that's I go back to the natural process. But to me, diversity, inclusion, and equity is a learning and change process. We help individuals learn, but we must change systems. And
Mhm,
so to try to put the entire onus of diversity and inclusion and equity on individuals is misguided because systems, policies, and procedures and the like drive behavior not only in organizations, they drive behavior in society. So policies and laws that are biased and privilege some while subordinating others. Um, the diversity learning and change process, you individuals learn, but systems must be changed. And so I do think, in short, people can learn and grow. And we know from research from cognitive, social, and behavioral neuroscience, particularly neuroplasticity. So here's the connection. The reason why I believe individuals can learn, so I'll talk about individuals learning and changing systems. I'll make that distinction because the way you help individuals learn about bias and expand their capacity is basically through exposure. So they have to know about themselves and they have to know about diverse others. And so they need to be able to understand the interplay between similarities and differences, and recognize the differences, leverage the similarities to bridge the differences. Like, so people can learn how to do that, develop skills, so knowledge and skills, but also knowledge and skills is not enough. People have to have the will and commitment to act on those knowledge and skills. And then, the capacity. So I'll just give a quick example. If you want to coach for equity, because that's something I've been thinking a lot about. What's the first thing you need to know? Well, first thing you need to know is about coaching, and the coaching industry has done a great job of that. What the coaching industry has not done a great job of to coach for equity is you need to understand racism and white supremacy. The coaching industry won't touch that with a 10-foot pole, or at least they haven't. And they'll make anti-racism statements like they have with George Floyd, et cetera. But the ICF, for example, and I'm going to pick on them only because they're the largest professional association, not because they're the only one, but very few professional coach associations even know the racial demographics of their membership because they don't collect it. That's what I mean by systems. You measure what's important.
mm,
You hear me?
yeah.
So in any organization, it doesn't matter whether it's profit or nonprofit, right? You measure what's important. No metrics, no movement. So I think that anti-racism, and so moving from being racist to anti-racism, I think uh, racism is a reality. Anti-racism is an ideal,
Mhm.
just like equity is an ideal. And so I don't mean that negatively, but it's nothing that we ever. So when we say moving from to, it almost suggests that we get there,
Mhm.
we become an anti-racist. No, you don't. None of us ever reached that ideal. America has been trying to realize the idea of equity in the land of the free and the brave for centuries.
Mhm.
But we still have racism and
Mhm.
bias,
True.
etc. Right? So it's an ideal. So I think you have
So
to
then,
start
what
there.
is it that we can achieve?
Well, I think if we talk about individuals learning, it starts with self-work, right? So it starts with understanding the origins of your cultural programming and understand that we are all culturally diverse beings and we all have identity markers based on various dimensions of diversity, all those that I sort of listed and some that I didn't list. So I think the first part is origins of cultural programming, doing things like taking implicit bias tests to understand that bias is a natural
Mhm.
phenomenon. So awareness becomes really important. Things like the intercultural development inventory, like understanding how we can skew differences in general. But then that's not enough. We need micro interventions, i.e., anti bias work focused on targets, people who receive racism or any ism, significant others, parents, partners, whatever, right? They're part of the equation. Allies, right? People who are not targets but allies, so people from the majority group, and well-intended bystanders, right? And perpetrators. When you so it requires everyone in the system to be involved. You can't just focus on the oppressed or the oppressors because there are a lot of roles that aren't either of those.
Mhm. Mhm.
There are bystanders who aren't the oppressor or the oppressed, but they're bystanders. So they contribute to either reinforcing or not.
That's-
There are perpetrators who are actually, quote, oppressing, and so the learning agenda for each of those groups are different. But that's where the learning can happen. But again, I think that work is really important. Yet, I don't believe that. I think we place too much emphasis on helping individuals learn and grow. And yet, if you don't, so when I work with organizations on diversity and inclusion, I do a what I call a systems audit, and that's where we start.
Mhm. Terry, I'm watching time as well.
That's
You have just said that we must change systems. But
correct.
it's not that easy. So
Of course,
when we think about Barack Obama or women in leadership positions, sometimes a member of a minority group can be in a very privileged position. So the systems are stronger than individuals. Why can't they change systems, and when and how will change come?
well, I think so. If we, a lot of people were disappointed and or confused by President Obama on both sides of the quote equation because people view, quote, the president of the United States as one of the most powerful roles in the world. Yet, the president of the United States is embedded in a powerful system with a legacy of over hundreds of years. So to expect that any person, um, especially the first Black president, can make significant change, I think is really naive and misguided. So there are endless uh, privileges based on a range of diversity. And so we, the so-called model minorities, potentially implied in why can't they change, is because we can't change the system by ourselves because those systems are nested in embedded systems. The government is embedded in social systems, which is embedded in a legal system, which is embedded in a various cultural systems. So yes, the system is stronger than individuals, yet we collectively can change systems. Thus, diversity, inclusion, and equity change process at its core is about not only changing minds and hearts, but changing systems. And I think so when I look at the major progress, for example, that has been done in this country, slavery ended, but there was not a lot of progress in this country until 1965. You know what happened in 1965?
Yeah.
There was a major system change.
Mm.
It was called the Civil Rights Act.
Mhm.
And the Civil Rights Act changed some policies. And the Civil Rights Act of 65 actually was the roots of some of the racial tension that we're having today, right? Because people like me, I was in the second generation of those who went to college based on the Civil Rights Act, right? Um, so as an individual, I have a lot of privilege that I have privilege based on my educational attainment. I have privilege related to the university that I work with. In fact, I have a lot of influence in the coaching industry that has not a lot to do with my being Black. It has everything to do with those sources of privilege. And yet, when I walk out of those circles and move to other circles, that privilege there does not transfer when I'm driving my car and get stopped by the police, right? So there's a legal system, there's a police system, right? And so, and so I am very clear that there's been a lot of progress since 65, but here's some of the unintended consequences of that change. That change is that we had generations. I'll talk about my own corporate experience. We had generations, and this is grounded in my own autobiographical experience. We had generations. I worked in a corporation, great company for me, did a lot of things. Again, I had a lot of privileges in that company. And yet I represented, unbeknown to me, a threat that I think allowed um, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way. I understand why Trump got elected, but we can't. Everyone tries to focus on Trump. Trump's not the issue. Trump is a symptom of a broader dynamic, right? And that dynamic is
Sure.
that when I worked for a corporation where there were multiple generations of white males who subliminally, maybe not so subliminally always, basically were told that if you keep your nose clean, you will grow in this organization. What they never said to me or would say out loud, but it was an implied contract in that you will always be superior to Blacks. Then comes along the product of a civil rights movement, second generation, go to Ohio State, get to this corporation, wound up having my mentor wound up being the CEO of the company eventually. So I kind of got promoted as he did because I was his quote protege or one of them. And so when I was 39, I got promoted to the head of organizational effectiveness, learning training that had a big group and lots of people reporting to me. So there were several white males over 40 who were reporting to me who had never in their life imagined not only working for a Black man, but working for a Black man. You couldn't say that I didn't have the experience. I had it. You couldn't say that I didn't have the education. I had more education than most of them. And even if they had the education, you couldn't say I didn't have it from a great place because I had a state degree, but I also had 2 Ivy League degrees, right? And so I was a disorientation to them. It wasn't me personally. It was, and it wasn't them personally, but it was a shift in the contract, the implied contract of what it meant to be white in America. And so that's what you are finding is as the demographics are changing, and so white supremacy is not about demographics, it's about power. It's about who has the power and who doesn't.
Yes.
So I have power. I have positional power, I have affiliate power, I have income. I'm in terms of my socioeconomic status, it's certainly beyond where I grew up, but I am keenly aware of the systems that as a Black man in this country, if I'm not aware of, I may not exist. Right. And so when I talk about changing systems, that's exactly what I mean. Because and so in this country, corporations have discovered that they can't be silent with these issues because some of the very executives, white, Black, so when we think about millennials in this country, the millennials in this country grew up under a different contract. They have a different conception of racism. They actually have more exposure to others, intimate cultural living experiences. They date across races a lot more frequently than my generation or the generation before my generation, et cetera. So, so that generation, I have hope because that generation thinks very different than my generation, that thinks very different than the generation that followed my generation, that's before their generation, that thinks certainly different than the generations that preceded me. And so they are some of the people who are now in power, or if they're not in power now, they will be. And so they will be in a position to change.
Change.
My CEO, who was a white male, when I was in corporate, had daughters. He didn't have any sons. And so his, as he watched his daughters grow, his motivation for diversity was learning how his daughters were treated in society. And he didn't like it. And then he started wondering, because he loved them, and he started wondering what it was like for women to work in his organization. And so our entry into diversity was not about race. Our entry into diversity at that corporation was about gender
Mhm.
and gender equity. And guess what? Because he had a personal commitment to it, the numbers changed. And the numbers didn't change because of quotas. The numbers changed because he had a genuine understanding and commitment to change things.
Mhm.
And so I see, I don't believe that diversity and inclusion or equity work is real unless I see explicit work, because you can, so there's anti-bias training that we can do. Yet if the system is rewarding behavior that is not consistent with that, then you're rewarding A and hoping for B,
Yeah.
right? And so that's why I am very confident. I'm not concerned about individuals learning. I'm not concerned about that at all. I know because of neuroplasticity, with frequency, duration, intensity, and repetition of exposure to others, that individuals can learn. However, I know that behavior is a function of the person and the environment. That if you don't change the systems concurrent with that learning, the learning is at best suboptimized and at worst useless.
Terry, it is lovely to listening to you, and it's lovely to having this conversation with you. But our time is up. Uh,
Yep.
thank you so much for this insightful conversation, and thank you for sharing your personal experiences. I appreciate that, and I would say stay and selfie, stay safe and healthy when I close this session. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. It was a pleasure having an opportunity to chat with you about a topic for which you clearly can see I have a lot of passion
Yeah, I
for.
can. I really appreciate that. Thank you.